So the last piece we need to talk about with conditional statements is the law of detachment and syllogism. Now, there are other places you can go with conditional statements. IXL has some different skills you could try if you found this topic to be interesting and you just want to do a little learning on your own. I would encourage you to take a look at the I section in geometry for conditional statements, truth tables, things like that. There's a lot of interesting things, but we will not be covering all those. All we'll be doing is wrapping up with law of detachment and syllogism. So this is a way that we can set up some if-then statements to make some proofs, and that's kind of where we've been headed this entire time. We want to talk about geometric proofs is kind of where we're headed, so we're going to look at conditional statements here. So the first one is the law of detachment. The law of detachment, written out symbolically, is like this. There's a general statement, a general if-then. Maybe like, if it's Monday, then we go to work. And then a specific example, whatever the date is, December 12th is a Monday. What can we conclude? That there's work that day. So specific example is P, and then the specific conclusion is therefore Q. General statement is P implies Q. So general statement, specific example, and then specific conclusion. It's very simple. It's actually almost so simple that it's kind of makes it a little bit confusing. Sometimes kids are like, well, shouldn't there be more to this? There's not. It's really that simple. So let's go through a couple. Okay, gardener knows that if it rains, the garden will be watered. It's raining. What conclusion can he make? That the garden will be watered. Very simple. All right, let's take a look at number 2 here. Does it illustrate the law of detachment? And you kind of figure out if you think it does. If you make a field goal in basketball, that is correct. There are field goals in basketball. It just means making a basket. So I know you might be thinking it's supposed to be football. If you make a field goal in basketball, you score 2 points. General statement. Jenna scored 2 points in basketball. Therefore, you conclude she made a field goal. Is that a good example of the law of detachment, yes or no? Well, let's take a look. This is not a good example of the law of detachment, and here's why. Remember, general statement, we have that, but then we need the P part. What we should have is Jenna made a field goal in basketball. There's other ways to make field goals in basketball, right? Or to get 2 points in basketball. You could shoot 2 free throw shots to get to 2 points. So this is not a good example of the law of detachment. It should say Jenna made a field goal, therefore you conclude she scored 2 points. That would be a correct setup. Let's look at one more here. If a student gets an A on a final exam, then the student will pass the course. There's our general statement. Specific example, Joan gets an A on the geometry final. You conclude she passes the geometry course. Is that a good use of the law of detachment? Yes, that works out. Joan will pass the geometry course. So this is a great example of the law of detachment. So that one's very simple. The second one we need to talk about is the law of syllogism. The law of syllogism says that if P implies Q and Q implies R, then P implies R. So let me actually write it out this way. It's a little bit easier to see. So P implies Q, Q implies R. Therefore, P implies R. These are kind of like links, okay? We've got a chain link here. The P statement connected to the Q statement. The Q statement is connected to the R statement. Therefore, we could kind of skip a step and just go from P to R. So again, let me give you kind of an example here. We said if it's Monday, then you have to go to work. Okay, so there's a P implies Q. If you go to work, then you will, let's just say, then you'll go out for lunch. So if you go to work, or if it's Monday, you'll go to work. If you go to work, you'll go out for lunch. Therefore, if it's Monday, then you will go out to lunch. That would be a case where we kind of skip the middle statement. We go from the original hypothesis and the final conclusion, jumping over that Q statement. That might be a little bit confusing. Let's look at an example here. Let's use the law of syllogism to draw a conclusion from the following statements. If a quadrilateral is a square, then it contains 4 right angles. If a quadrilateral contains 4 right angles, then it's a rectangle. So what can we assume? We can assume that if a quadrilateral is a square, then it is a rectangle. Notice how this right here and this overlap. We kind of you can almost think of crossing them out and seeing what you have left over. If it's a square, then it's a rectangle. All right, let's look at one or two more examples. So if the circus is in town, then there are tents at the fairground. If there's tents at the fairground, then Paul is working as a night watchman. So what can we conclude? If the circus is in town, then Paul is working as a night watchman. So again, we're just taking the parts in common and kind of crossing it out like that. All right. Last one. Let's take a look at this one. This gets a little tricky. If you're studying geometry, then you're studying math. If you're studying parallel lines, then you're studying geometry. So what is our conclusion here? Well, if I take a look, we might be tempted to say if you're studying geometry, then you're studying geometry, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. Notice what's happened here. They've actually switched these two statements, but that's still okay. So notice what we have in common. My conclusion is my Q and my P. So I need a P and a Q to match up for this to work. So then you're studying geometry matches up with your studying geometry. So you end up with, if you are studying parallel lines, then you are studying math. Okay, and it should look just like that. All right, so that wraps up our lesson on law of detachment and law of syllogism. So at this point, you can continue on doing the work posted on Google Classroom.